Well, hello friends and welcome to Ask Zach. You've probably heard that Nashville is a Telecaster-Town, or if you're going to move to Nashville, you got to have a Telecaster and things of that ilk. Well, that was not always the case, and the Telecaster was not an immediate hit in Nashville. In fact, it took close to almost 2 decades for the Telecaster to really take off as a kind of Nashville must-have instrument for a session player to have. And so today we're going to tell the story of the guys that really brought the Telecaster to Nashville and made it a must-have. So we're going to talk about early on a guy named Jabo Arrington and his broadcaster number 0048. We're going to talk about Billy Sanford, and we're going to talk about Fred Carter Jr., and we're also going to talk a little bit about the kind of Louisiana hayride guitarist, the guitar players of Shreveport of the late 1950s, which of course include Fred and Billy, plus James Burton and Roy Buchanan, and how all those guys knew each other and they were all rubbing off on each other, and they kind of formulated this style that really kind of defined, to me it kind of defines Telecaster playing to a degree, that mix of country and Dead Thumb blues, Lightnin' Hopkins, and and Scotty Moore, and all these things together that to me kind of make the style. And the argument could be made that Shreveport, Louisiana is where the Telecaster style kind of came together, including the use of light gauge strings, banjo strings. So I'm going to tell that story today. First off, just need to thank my Patreon members for supporting me. They keep this show going, and I so appreciate it. If you'd like to join them or find out more, then you can look in the description. All right, so as I said before, Nashville was not really friendly to the Telecaster. All the guys that were coming up in the 1950s were archtop guys. They all played electric hollow bodies made by Epiphone or Gibson or Gretsch. And they were not, and you have to remember that the Fender Broadcaster, Telecaster, Nocaster, Esquire, all those solid body guitars were really out of the norm. And you have to think about those things kind of like the way we saw a Steinberger or something in the mid 1980s, or a Parker Fly, or other things that were just kind of like, what the hell is that? And that's kind of the way you have to realize that that was kind of the attitude toward the Fender guitar, especially by actually older players, established players that had already, their heroes were like Charlie Christian and guys that were playing with the, Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys and stuff like that. All their guys played hollow body guitars with pickups. And so all of a sudden you've got this weird, canoe paddle or toilet seat with a neck on it. There were all sorts of names in which they called the broadcaster, Telecaster thing. So one of the first guys to really kind of start to make an impact, but unfortunately he dies unfortunately very young, is a guy named Jabo Arrington. So Jabo was, according to Bob Moore, the great A-Team bass player, he was a mentor to Grady Martin, which that's really significant. So Jabo came up in the 40s and was playing, Western swing and other stuff, and kind of in that swing style, and he purchased a broadcaster. He had broadcaster number 0048. And he played that guitar on sessions and on the Opry and out on the road with little Jimmy Dickens. And he was kind of famous for playing these twin guitar things, and a lot of them were recorded with either Hank Garland or with Grady Martin. And so just to kind of give you an idea of what this sounds like, of course I don't have 2 guitars with me, so I'm going to kind of double stop this to kind of let you hear it. And so this is kind of an approximation of a little Jimmy Dickens tune called Sorry I'm Out of Business. So it starts off with this lick kind of like this. So that was the kind of thing. Of course, it's two guitars playing that, but yeah, and that was kind of a popular stylistic thing of that era of the late 40s, early 1950s, where you heard a lot of twin guitar stuff that came out of the whole Western swing thing, and also, you know, the pop music of the day, big band stuff where you had horn stuff. So a lot of those lines kind of sound like horn lines. Well, unfortunately, Jabo died in 1952, and so his impact kind of lived on to a degree through Grady Martin, but Grady didn't end up picking up a Telecaster. Instead, he played a Bigsby. So it's kind of the daddy of the broadcaster. So he played a Bigsby for a bit. In fact, he had a single neck, and then he had a double neck that had an octave neck on it. And he played that quite a bit throughout the 50s, but he did not go to the Telecaster. So the Fender guitar kind of languished a bit as far as the session players were concerned in Nashville. Now, road guys used them, so like Leon Rhodes and other cats that were playing with Ray Price and others, they gravitated towards solid bodies, and they played Telecasters and Strats, and you know, even of course by the mid 50s they're playing gold top Les Pauls and different things like that of that ilk. But the session guys were not quick to gravitate toward the solid body. Probably the first Fender solid body that the old school A-team guys gravitated toward was the Fender Jazzmaster in the late 1950s. So they kind of liked that because it had a twangier sound, but it was a little warmer, and it had a vibrato bar, and they, you know, of course it had a deep rhythm sound. And so that, you know, you'll see pictures of Harold Bradley and other cats, you know, playing Jazzmasters, and they kind of liked that quite a bit better than the Tele. So the Tele kind of dies a quick death, you know, unfortunately in the early 50s, and doesn't really get picked up. So how does it make it to Nashville? Well, there was this whole other school of kind of finishing and guitar playing that came out of Shreveport, Louisiana. So Shreveport is a northern Louisiana town. It had a lot of oil field, you know, work, and of course oil field workers, and those guys like to drink and party. So there was a lot of clubs in kind of the Shreveport, Bossier City kind of area. Also, you had the Louisiana Hayride, and as far as regional radio shows, the biggest one was the Grand Ole Opry, but the one right below that was the Louisiana Hayride. And the Louisiana Hayride, most of the stars that made it onto the Opry went through the Louisiana Hayride because it was kind of a natural stepping stone that you'd move up from some of the other smaller shows, like maybe in Chicago or what have you, and then you would come up, or Dallas, the Big D Jamboree, then you would get up to the Louisiana Hayride. That was the big time, you know, and then the step above the Louisiana Hayride was the Opry. Well, a lot of guitar players from the area and otherwise came to Shreveport for work because they could get work perhaps on the Louisiana Hayride, and they could certainly get work playing in the clubs. And so you ended up with a group of guys that all ended up playing Telecasters, all experimented with banjo strings, and all mixed blues, a lot of Lightnin' Hopkins. They mixed the Scotty Moore style that was on the Elvis records. They mixed, you know, kind of the Chet Atkins thing. They mixed, you know, the string bending style, which of course was made, you know, you could do it because of the banjo strings that they were also experimenting with. They also all were using flat picks, and a lot of them were using metal finger picks also, like Fred Carter Jr. and James Burton. So it's really interesting. These guys all are rubbing off on each other. They're all stealing each other's licks. They're all playing Telecasters. And so again, these guys are James Burton, Fred Carter Jr., Billy Sanford, and Roy Buchanan. All these guys are in the Shreveport area all around the same period of time. And a lot of times they're playing with a lot of the same artists even. So you have a guy like Dale Hawkins that has a hit with Susie Q that originally he has James Burton, but then he ends up with Roy Buchanan playing with him later, and Roy's on My Babe. And you have, some of those guys played with David Houston, and they played with Bob Luman and all sorts of stuff. So all these guys were kind of formulating this guitar style together, and they were going and seeing each other play, and they were stealing from each other. In fact, Billy Sanford told me a story about how Billy and James Burton wanted to go see Roy Buchanan play. And of course, Roy was already doing amazing stuff in the late 1950s, and so they wanted to go see him play. And they had to be real careful about doing it because they had to sneak into the club. And they didn't have to sneak into the club because of their age. They had to sneak into the club because Roy Buchanan didn't want anyone to steal his licks. So if a guitar player that he knew came in the bar, he would dumb down his playing, and instead of playing hot licks, he would just play like if he took a solo, he'd do like a straight melody or something like that. But he wouldn't do the string bending or behind the nut bends or anything of that sort. So they would have to sneak in to go see Roy, and they were stealing from him. They were all stealing from each other. And so who is the guy, the first one to put banjo strings on a Telecaster? I don't know, but all those guys were doing it about the same time. So I'm not gonna make that call, but know that all of them were doing that, and all of them made very significant impacts on the Telecaster and the way it's played. So of course you had James goes out, from Shreveport, he goes out to Los Angeles to play with Bob Luman. He's recording out there, and Ricky Nelson sees them, and he steals the band away from Bob Luman. Wasn't very nice of him, but of course it was a upgrade in pay, for James and the rest of the band. And of course they end up on national television and getting paid well. And of course James goes on to become one of the most important and significant Telecaster players of all time, making a huge impact in the Los Angeles area, playing on recordings by Merle Haggard and Buck Owens, of course all the Ricky Nelson stuff. You have the Graham Parsons, Emmylou Harris, the Elvis things, all that stuff, incredibly significant. Then you have Fred Carter Jr., who he went off playing with Ronnie Hawkins, Dale Hawkins' cousin, and he goes up to Canada, and he takes the Telecaster to Canada and helps popularize it with his own playing, and also through the playing of his student Robbie Robertson. And so Robbie Robertson learns about banjo strings and metal finger picks and Telecasters and playing through Tweed Bassmans. All that stuff comes from Fred Carter Jr., who was teaching him how to play. And so that's where you get that style. And of course you also have Roy Buchanan goes up and plays for a short period of time with Ronnie Hawkins, and he also shows Robbie Robertson some licks and tricks. But after Fred plays with Ronnie Hawkins, he moves to Nashville, and he ends up getting to be a very popular guitarist here, and ends up working a lot for Chet Atkins, doing a lot of sessions for him. He ends up playing on, Waylon Jennings recordings, all sorts of stuff. And of course, famous daughter, Dina Carter, that had a hit with Strawberry Wine. But also you have Billy Sanford. So Billy Sanford, who is probably, kind of like Fred Carter Jr. in that he's not a really well-known player, but and the reason that Billy Sanford isn't well known is that a lot of the sessions that he played on, it was for Billy Sherrill, who of course was doing all the George Jones and Tammy Wynette records, and he didn't put credits on the albums. Even into the 70s, when it got to be kind of a thing where you put the credits on there, Billy Sherrill never did that. And so Billy played on tons of stuff, but Billy moved from Shreveport straight to Nashville in the early 1960s, and he got a gig pretty quickly playing with this guy named Roy Orbison. And in fact, they went and toured in England, playing shows with the Beatles. They came back to Nashville, and they had a recording session where they recorded this tune called Pretty Woman. And so Billy is one of the guitarists on Pretty Woman playing the riff. So there's 4 guitarists on the session. There's Roy himself, and I believe he's playing the acoustic 12-string. Then there's Wayne Moss, Jerry Kennedy, and Billy Sanford. And so depending on what they were trying to do dynamically, they would either have one or more guitars playing the riff. So sometimes, you know, like the first time the riff is played at the beginning of the song, it's just one guitar. And then as it goes along, more and more guitars come in to give it more and more impact. So yeah, so that was Billy. And of course, playing on a big hit like Pretty Woman helped Billy Sanford start a session career in Nashville. And he had a 55 Tele and a dot neck 335. And he starts playing on tons of sessions, and he also, like Fred Carter Jr., ends up playing on Waylon Jennings recordings, and which is really cool. But also it's very sad because, you know, Waylon was a great guitarist, and Waylon really didn't get to play much on his own records until into the 1970s. But there's a really great Billy Sanford solo on a Waylon record. It's called "Don't Let the Sun Go Down on You in Tulsa." It's a mouthful of a title, but that is some really great playing by old Billy Sanford. So they brought, again, it's those guys, and you know, of course, Roy Buchanan ends up, you know, he does some different things, but then he really ends up going back to DC, and then we don't really hear from him again until, you know, in the early 70s when they have the PBS documentary about him, and he gets the deal with Polydor, and he does, you know, Roy Buchanan and second album, and on and on. But these guys, these Shreveport guys, they all kind of had this thing in common. They all, you know, knew how to use the back pickup and the banjo strings, and they, you know, they all were listening to Lightnin' Hopkins, and you have the Burton, you know, like him doing Susie Q. You know, you have that kind of thing, and just kind of that whole dead thumb thing that comes from Lightnin' Hopkins that all those guys did. And the string bending thing that all that, you know, came out of those guys, and then they went in all directions. But it was, you know, it was really, I would give credit to Fred Carter Jr. and Billy Sanford, really, for bringing the Telecaster to Nashville, for really kind of making it a thing and making it acceptable. Also, we have to give credit to, you know, James, you know, out in Los Angeles playing on hits with, you know, with Merle Haggard and Buck Owens and others that helps popularize the sound. And the Ricky Nelson recordings. I mean, he made that Telecaster sound popular in pop music with Ricky Nelson, and also, you know, in country music with the stuff he was doing with Merle and Buck. And so those things pushed the Telecaster to really be acceptable. And so finally, everyone started, you know, at least having a Telecaster. Maybe it wasn't their favorite instrument, but, you know, they had their 335 or a Les Paul or what have you that maybe was their main instrument, and yet they'd have a Telecaster with them so that they could, you know, get that twangy, greasy kid guitar sound if people wanted it. And into the 70s, you know, of course, you get guys like, you know, you get Reggie Young moving to town, and one of the early things he plays on is Drift Away, which of course has a Les Paul Deluxe playing the intro and the stuff in the verse, but then that's a Telecaster doing the, you know, doing that twangy low string thing. And then you even have things like, you know, you have the Kendalls, you know, doing Heaven's Just a Sin Away, and that's Fred Newell. And so Fred Newell, you know, is another guy that needs to be given credit for kind of popularizing and keeping the Telecaster, you know, kind of building in popularity throughout the 70s, you know, along with Reggie and others. And then really in the 1980s, even though, you know, everyone was playing Strats, there were a number of guys, you know, high profile guys that were playing Telecasters in the 80s that were really, you know, kind of making it cool in Nashville. And that was, you know, you had Steve Warner playing a Glazer Tele, you had Ricky Skaggs doing the same thing, Ricky Skaggs' guitarist Ray Flack playing a Tele and playing all those great solos. And you know, and that kind of paves the way for, you know, for guys like Brent Mason, who comes up, you know, as a major session guy in the late 1980s, early 90s. And to me, that's when you really enter the era of where the Telecaster is kind of king. I really don't think it becomes the big guitar in Nashville until the 1990s. And I think a lot of it had to do with Brent Mason. So, you know, as far as him solidifying the place that the Telecaster now holds. But we need to give credit to those early cats, Fred Carter Jr. and Billy Sanford, and even back to Jabo. And just a side note on Jabo Arrington, his broadcaster number 0048 ended up being sold to Vince Gill in the last decade or so. And Vince played the broadcaster with little Jimmy Dickens on stage. And then when little Jimmy Dickens passed away, he played the Jabo's broadcaster on the memorial service. And I thought that was a really cool, you know, kind of, you know, way of remembering Jabo and his, you know, significance. All right, guys. Well, I'm going to make a Spotify playlist just to, you know, give you some early, you know, Nashville Telecaster stuff, and there'll be a link in the description for that. Also, I'm going to link to a great article by my friend Rich Kinsley, and really the only reason I know about Jabo is from Rich Kinsley, because Rich did a compilation CD for Guitar Player magazine back in the late 80s, early 90s, and it had Jabo and Grady Martin playing, you know, on Little Jimmy Dickens' "Sorry, you know, I'm Out of Business," which I love that track, and if I'll put that on the playlist. And then, of course, Rich Kinsley wrote a wonderful article for Vintage Guitar Magazine talking about Vince Gill getting the Jabo broadcaster and such. So I'll put a link to that article also, because if you want to do a little bit of a deeper dive, you can follow that up. All right, guys. Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.